Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to review our third topic in our line of Core Web Vitals, Cumulative Layout Shift. I am Mark Kosierowski, one of Blue Triangle's customer success analysts. And joining me today also is Ciaran. He was your host for the previous session, for the FID session. We're just going to go ahead and dive right in. We've already covered largest contentful paint. That's our general performance metric. We've also covered FID at this point, which went over interactivity and responsiveness on the page. And today we're just going to be capping that off with Cumulative Layout Shift, which deals with visual stability. So what is Cumulative Layout Shift? Cumulative Layout Shift focuses on visual stability. And what does that mean? Think of the example as you're going to click on something on a website and you go to click and everything on the page shifts down and you end up clicking the wrong thing. You go to a part of the website that isn't what you intended to be on and you end up in the wrong place and you're frustrated, you close the tab and you leave the site. That's effectively what we're trying to fix with Cumulative Layout Shift. Cumulative Layout Shift as a metric is looking to see how many of these shifts are occurring on that page and then tallying them all up to give you a score. You might note that the CLS is different from its other Core Web Vital brethren in that it does not have seconds on the end of it. This is due to its unique way it's calculated. We'll be reviewing that here in just a moment, as well as telling you how you can improve CLS using the following techniques and tricks, many of which boil down to keeping your content as set as possible on the page and do not allow for other images to load above already loaded images. If there's something you need to load, if there's something new from the interaction, make sure it's transformative rather than existing content. Again, we're going to go through that, but let's start off first with how that metric is calculated. So Cumulative Layout Shift has two factors that go into each shift it calculates. It has impact fraction and distance fraction. Impact fraction, as you can see on the left here, is the combined distance of the image and the area of the image moved through the relation to the viewport. Basically, think total space the image existed in before and after the shift. We're going to take that. You can see on this, it's basically the image is taking up about 50% of the screen, and then it's leaving behind, it's moved about 25% of the screen. So the total space of that is 75% of your viewport. So that's going to be our total for impact fraction, is going to be 75%. You'll note that this means larger images are going to have a greater effect on your CLS score than smaller ones. It's also why the CLS score can have more of an effect on mobile devices because of images taking up so much of your viewport on those. That's basically how the impact fraction is figured out. For distance fraction, we're looking for the greatest distance any unstable element has moved in the frame, either horizontally or vertically. And then we're going to divide that by the largest dimension of the viewport, either height or width, whichever one is greater. So again, in this example, it's moved 25% down the page. The image has moved 25% down the page, so our distance fraction is going to be 25%. We're going to multiply those scores together. So you're going to multiply the 75% times 25%, and you're going to get a score of 0.1875 for your CLS score. Now, keep in mind, that is one shift. So, I mean, it's a pretty huge shift because it's taking up so much of the viewport in this example, but this is one example of this. And if this was the score, your score at the end of the day, it would be, Google would say, this is too high. This would be already in the needs improvement. How do we prevent or fix this from happening on your website? So the first thing we need to do is be able to see where these changes are occurring. One of the things, seeing a screenshot after your site loads or trying to eyeball these changes as they're happening are really challenging. So Blue Triangle can make that easier. Blue Triangle synthetics include a film strip option where a snapshot is taken every 250 milliseconds as your website loads. This way we can see when things appear on your website. It'll also give you boxes to indicate when the major performance events are occurring. So you can kind of see in there, you can see total blocking time, first contentful paint, speed index, large contentful paint, all those fun things. But the one we're going to be focusing on right now is cumulative layout shift ends, that green box at 1,750 milliseconds. That's the one we're going to be focused on. I also blew up two of the screenshots at the bottom so you can see where that last shift is taking place on the website. We actually have a couple things happening here. We have a couple shifts going on. One of them is between 1,000 milliseconds and 1,250 milliseconds, where the screen shifts some of the content down. And one final one at 1,500 and 1,750 milliseconds, where the orange box shifts some of the text off the screen. These are two relatively small shifts altogether, but just as a note for this page, when this loaded, the CLS score for this was 0.106, which would be just outside of the green zone for Google scoring. So this would be considered needs improvement. So not a lot of shifting here, and this is still not good enough as far as Google is concerned. So now that we have a portal into how we can see those changes and where we need improvement, how do we do that? Well, first thing to do is include size attributes to the elements on the page. What do I mean by that? Well, we want to make sure we include the appropriate amount of size and space on the site to load something so that when the image comes in, it's not changing anything. In this example, you can see that a box appeared at 2,000 milliseconds, where it says time to interact at 2,000 milliseconds. We can see that there was that black box appeared at the bottom of the screen, but it didn't shift anything. Let's blow that up so you can see that a little better. There you go. Because the size attribute was accounted for, and this did not result in a shift, it didn't contribute to the cumulative layout shift score. You can also make use of an unsized media policy when you're coding images to force them to certain dimensions. I'm going to actually include a link for that down at the bottom of this presentation so you can go ahead and take a look at that. That's a little bit too complicated for us to really go over in detail today, but I'll leave a link at the bottom so you can take a look at that. Next way we can improve this is we want to make sure we never insert content above existing content. That's really, really important. So in the example here, we can see that some of the diagonal graphics that were included on the page, so where we see the diagonal lines are included in the blue box, ended up pushing some of the text off the page. You can see some of the text on the second screenshot has been pushed down. Ideally, we would want to avoid moving that forward and not try to load anything above what we already have in place. This is probably the most straightforward thing. Basically, you just want to always try to build your page so that it's always building down. Try to avoid banners loading at the top and shoving everything else down afterwards. So if you're going to load the banner, try to load those banners first. Ideally, have that before you do this. Otherwise, you're going to be pushing things down the stream. Finally, we're going to go over using transformation animations or movement-based ones. So we're going to go back 2 slides here. You'll note here between 1750 and 2000 milliseconds, we did have a pop-up banner happening. So you should see on this page, there's like a pop-up banner that occurred here. You'll note though that it came over the top of the image, like it didn't actually move anything down. This will not register anything for cumulative layout shift concerns. Basically, the name of the game here is stability, and everything that comes, we want to keep things as still as possible. Think of it as a glass of water and you don't want to tip the water over. You want everything to stay stable. Keep in mind, these are just some of the guidelines for CLS, and there's a lot of things to consider when dealing with these. Now, Google gives out some of the causes for a bad CLS score. Some of these we've already touched upon, like any image file you have, make sure that it has the dimensions set up ahead of time. Especially when you're dealing with ads. Ads a lot of times will be very dynamic in origin. They will kind of fill up or blow up or whatnot. So the thing you want to make sure is that your ads are either at the top of the page or you have some kind of ad delivery service that makes it so that it goes inside of a box that keeps that from shifting too much. Because those are the ones that are going to shift on you the most. You can see here in this example that the ad is pushing all of the information down the page, and you have a content shift at this point. So all that content has been shifted by this ad. So what we do here is just basically have an ad holder, have a box set up, say, I'm going to start my content a certain distance down the page to ensure that when this ad does pop in, even if it pops in after my other content, I've got room already set up for that ad to go, so that I'm now have no layout shift on this page because this loaded in first. Even if that ad comes in later, I know I haven't had any shifts on the page. Dynamically injected content usually falls in the same bucket as the previous two. Basically, anything you have that's coming in either from a third party or first party, any images you have, if it's dynamic, it could come in at a weird angle or a weird or blow up bigger than you're expecting. Maybe you don't have it sized based on the size of the viewport, depending on the size of the viewport. Just make sure any dynamically injected content is being looked at and boxed appropriately on your site. That, again, name of the game, stability. You're trying to make sure that the images you have do not shift anything else on the page. So if you've set aside enough room for those things, this won't happen. Final thing on that, on this one as well, is web fonts. A lot of times you'll see on a page a font start as one font and it'll change to a different font as the page is loading. And when that happens, you'll note that stuff shifts. We actually had one of these examples on this page. You can see here, I don't believe the font changed on this example, but it did get bold. It did bolden. So you'll notice that the word villain here got shift down to the next part. And what did that do? That shifted everything else. That's another cumulative layout shift. Basically, if you're going to have a font, make sure that your fonts are consistent. If you have to reload a font, make sure that you've, again, blocked off enough stuff so that if anything that's loaded underneath that has the room to effectively grow, keeping everything as stable as possible on the site. Again, this is a very common cause. This is actually one of the things I see most often on sites is you'll have multiple fonts loaded onto the page. You'll have a starter font, a backup font that's loaded in initially, and then the main font loads, and then everything shifts down the page. And it's barely noticeable to a lot of people, but it is shifting things down, and it will cause you to get dinged on cumulative layout shift for all of these other images that were down here. Like all of this moved, and as we looked at previously, if we go back to here, this is impact fraction. Even though that small word didn't seem like a lot, it moved things that were far bigger than it, and it ended up moving those things down the page. So like right here, just because that villain moved to the next line, all of this text moved down the page. So all of this text, this graphic moved down. All of those things count for your CLS score. So ultimately, what's the point of all this? Why does Google care about CLS? They care because this is probably one of the metrics I feel personally, I've dealt with a lot of these performance metrics. I have felt that this one actually reflects user frustration the most, user friction. This is dealing the most with how much a customer is going to come onto your site, click on something, and they want to be able to click the thing they want to click on. And if they're not able to do that, that is the thing that causes the most customer frustration. Every one of us has had a bad CLS experience sometime when they've been on a website. Whether they've closed the tab or they've continued on, they've been frustrated. And CLS is one of those things that it seems like it's easy to fix, but it's not. And there's a lot of things you can do by, again, making sure, going back to this, making sure you have images without dimensions, your ads are embedded. Make sure you have size set up for each of these. Make sure that all of your images are wrapped so that you know how much room they're going to take. Make sure your dynamic content is boxed appropriately. Make sure your fonts are loading properly. All these things will have a huge impact on being able to prevent deep cuts into your CLS score. And with that, I believe we will open it up for Q&A.
Hey Mark, so a quick one from myself here. So one of the questions is, how do we measure CLS like in the lab? So One of the great features of Blue Triangle that Mark actually showed was the film strips feature. Now, while this is a very, it's a very good way that we can have a look at what's actually causing our CLS. They only capture sort of the layout shifts from a single page load, or a single or repeated page load experience. Whereas the run measurements, they're going to be more reflective of what real users, as they accept cookies, what they see as they experience and interact with the site. So, the idea is that you combine both the labs through the synthetics and the film strips, but also that real user data to see actually what's actually happening for your real users.
Yeah, the most important thing with film strip is to keep in mind the whole reason we use the film strip for that is to be able to visualize. A lot of CLS is a very visual metric. It's very much intended to be something that the user sees, something the customer can see on their end, something that will create a friction point for them as they're going about their journey. And the film strip allows us to see how that's loaded because a customer can click on a site anytime they want to. Whether or not they're going to get a response in the right place is up to how the site loads. And so being able to see the journey from the film strip view, I'm just going to switch back real quick. Being able to see this journey, being able to see each of these places. So like when I get to here, a customer might go, I'm going to click that red image. Like, well, hopefully that image stays in the right spot as it's loading, because if it doesn't, then they might click at the wrong spot, and then they're going to be frustrated, and then they might close the tab, or they might go to a competitor, and that's something we desperately want to avoid.
Thanks, Mark. And I've got another question as well. So, will optimizing for the CLS on mobile or desktop have an impact on the other device? Now, one of the things, as Mark sort of went over earlier, is obviously the viewport is very different when it comes to a mobile device and a desktop device. So it doesn't necessarily, just because we're optimizing for CLS on desktop doesn't mean it would actually change the experience for the better on the mobile device, and vice versa. So what it's important to do, and this is exactly how Google looks at you, is from a desktop and a mobile perspective, how is your CLS? How is the CLS occurring? The CLS for the items and resources that are driving your CLS score could be the entire, basically the entire, take up the entire screen on a mobile device. Whereas on desktop, this might not even be a factor. So it's important to look at the CLS from two different angles as well there.
Yeah, viewport is a huge part of what affects the score on when it comes to the impact fraction right here. So viewport, that's why mobile devices will see usually a lot more severe cases of CLS issues on mobile devices than we would necessarily on a desktop device.
Brilliant. And then we've got one. So one last question here: is CLS score calculated only for content above the fold when the page is loading? So basically, the CLS is calculating relative to the largest dimensions of the viewport. So what the browser is loading in at any one time. That's what it's going to be. That's what it's basically going to be looking at. So as soon as the user hits your device, the viewport is what's going to be loading in. If your user is a return user, for example, and they have navigated to the bottom of the page, the bottom or the middle of the page, the viewport is what's going to be instructing Google on that CLS.
One of the clever things people will do sometimes with that is they will load a bunch of information at the bottom under the fold, and then have a button to say click. It'll say click to load, and it'll load it'll load more information. That way, they're not worrying about that information shifting as it's going through. It's kind of a trick to basically avoid any issues with CLS. But thank you everybody for attending today. There is a link to that unsized media. That is a rabbit hole, though, just as a note, just to go through and see how to resize your media. I do recommend it, though. It's a really good read to be able to see how to incorporate that policy to be able to include ways to wrap your media properly, so that even if it comes in and it's an unknown amount, the big thing on that is, like, if you have something that's like, say, 300, you have a width of 300 by 150, you want to be able to define that as, I want that always to come in at this rate, or I want this, even if an image comes in at a weird amount, I want to be able to say, always to set it to this one. And so unsized media will kind of give you an idea of how to wrap those images a little bit more. So you have a little bit more consistency and you're going to run into less CLS issues. So that's what I got for today. If you have any questions or concerns, please, as always, reach out to your customer success managers. And if you need to, reach out to our support team. But thank you very much for attending. Very much appreciate it.